I'm Kimberly Garza. Yes, Dr. Kimberly Garza, Kim, if you know me. I am a writer and a professor. I write and teach creative writing. I work primarily in fiction, but I also write nonfiction as well. I'm from Uvalde, Texas. So I'm here in San Antonio, from very near here. And I was born in Galveston and raised in Uvalde. I identify as mixed race. I guess I would say Tejana, Asian. My mother was an immigrant from the Philippines, and my father is Mexican American from the Rio Grande Valley. Like, family has been in that area and in Mexico since, generations and generations, right? Like so many of us. I feel very fortunate to be back in the place that I know. I've only ever lived in Texas. I've lived in different parts of Texas, but I'm back here in what feels most like home. San Antonio feels very, very familiar and in like all the best ways. So yeah.
Which parts of Texas have you lived in?
And I went to college in Austin. Then I worked up in Dallas, went back to graduate school in Austin. Then I moved to Houston. Then I moved to Denton in very North Texas. From Denton, I came here. So sort of bouncing around like East and North Texas. Haven't made it quite out West Texas yet. That's, I think, my region that I don't know very well. It just feels like New Mexico. At that point, it's just New Mexico.
Have you been to West Texas?
Very
Big
briefly. Yeah. Like, I've been to El Paso. As kids, we used to go with our family to New Mexico a lot. So we would just sort of hang out in the drive-through on West Texas. And of course, like, a lot of my family is from the Houston area and from the Valley. So those feel like more closer to home, as opposed to like I lived there and they were new places that I explored.
Will you tell us a little bit about your journey to becoming a writer?
It was the sort of typical thing of a kid who loved to read. I wanted to be a writer, and I was very lucky to have parents who worked really hard to get out of their circumstances, but they did it through medicine. So I was expected to be a medical professional at some point. So I just assumed I would never be a writer. I thought, oh, well, that's something that's very hard. You have to be really lucky. I haven't written a novel. I don't know how to do this. I, for a while, thought I was going to be a medical doctor or a nurse. My mom was a nurse. But when I went to college, I knew that I wouldn't be able to study medicine. I just didn't have I didn't want to. It's like, I can't spend 4 years thinking about biology. So I majored as an English major. But again, I didn't think I would be a creative writer. I went into journalism, actually. So, because I thought this will pay, right? Like, I can work for a newspaper or a magazine. And I did that for all through college. And I worked at our student newspaper. And then my jobs outside of college were with magazines. So I worked as an editor and a writer doing, like long form journalism, travel journalism, which is not necessarily like hard news, but is not creative writing. But I kept getting burned out on that and then going back to creative writing. So I did journalism for 2 years, and then I went back to school and got my master's in creative writing. And then after that, I had to find a job. And so I went back to journalism. And then after that, I just kind of said, like, what am I doing? I think I want to be a writer, and I want to figure out how to write and to teach. I'd gotten to teach a little bit in my master's. So I went to a PhD program in creative writing and was able to kind of get my foot in the door as far as getting some writing published and building like some good fiction publications, not just nonfiction. And I got a dissertation, which is now the manuscript for my first book. Made a lot of contacts, got to teach, and knew I wanted to be a professor, and here we are.
Great. Will you tell us a little bit in terms of that journey, like who some of the mentors were in your various programs or outside of the program as well?
Most of my mentors have been, mostly professors. I just I didn't know anybody in my immediate circle and in my life who had done this before. So I didn't have like a friend or a family member to reach out to. So I've been very lucky with professors who've become friends and who've guided me. At UT Austin was the first place where I was able to start writing creatively. And I had professors like Elizabeth Harris kind of tell me, hey, you could do this like in a grad program. You could probably apply and get in. And I did. And then in my master's at UT, I had Elizabeth McCracken, I had Oscar Cáceres, like I had people who read my work. And then I started developing peers who read my work, right? And friends who were great writers and in different ways are still writers or just sort of engage with creative writing, whether they're writers themselves in publishing or whether they're teaching or whether they're just doing it, outside of the 9 to 5 and they've got to hustle. Really in my PhD program, I made a lot of friends and mentors. So I had upper division students who were older than me in the program who like taught me how to submit to journals. And my dissertation director, Miro Penkov, was like kind of pushing me at every point, like, think about this as a book, make this a book. I had a professor named Jill Talbot who would remind me of how to present myself as a candidate for jobs and push my creative journey ahead in just small ways of professionalism, which again, things that I had no idea how to do. Like, I don't have anybody to sort of guide you to do this. And it's one of the reasons I think about that a lot when I teach, because my students often have this big question of, I want to be a writer. I don't know what to do to make that happen. And I was like, cool. A lot of us don't know how to do that. Let's talk about some ways in which you might be able to. So I've been very lucky with people who've been willing to guide me along.
And has your focus always been on fiction? You said you also do creative nonfiction, and are those your kind of two main genres, or
Those are my
what's your
two.
relationship to genres?
Yeah, I like to say the world is better off that I'm not a poet. Like, that's my gift to the world, is that I'm not putting my poetry out there. So I wrote poetry in high school, and I look back and I'm like, oh no. Fiction was always my first love and still is. I sort of cheat with my fiction just because it's pulled from a lot of my nonfiction, right? It's pulled from life experience. It's pulled from people I know, really pulled from places I know. I write primarily stories about Texas, people in the various corners of Texas that I know and love and have issues with. My fiction feels cathartic just because I'm getting I'm inserting a lot of my nonfiction in there as well, in very sneaky and fictionalized ways. But I do also do nonfiction, creative nonfiction. I've written essays and I teach it, and I love reading it, and that's its own sort of catharsis and art, because that takes as my students know when I tell them, I was like, that takes guts, to just say like, hey, this is nonfiction and I'm just laying it out there for you. And I'm not always willing to go there when I write. My instinct is to frame it as fiction and, invent and create. And there's just something about nonfiction that I do a little more sparingly. Like, I have to be sort of in the zone and go, okay, yeah, what I'm writing is going to be nonfiction. This is not going to be shaped as a story. But I do both.
I'm just thinking about the role of place in your work, and people and place and geography. I am from Texas, from Corpus Christi. I have a love-hate relationship with Texas. Absolutely love it. Also have issues with it and want to make it a better place. Tell us about what are some of the issues, or what are some of your thoughts about like the relationship of place to your work, and how it influences your work?
It hugely influences my work. It's hard to escape it. I'm mostly influenced by place. Sort of starting point for a lot of my work is that I'm in this space where I'm thinking about, the place I want to write first, because place to me dictates the people who are there, and the people dictate to me the conflicts, and that gives me the genesis for a story. During my PhD, I was turning in a story for a workshop, and I was on a deadline, and I was thinking, what place do I want to start with? And I had just gone home for a visit. I'd been in Uvalde, and we'd gone up to the river. Uvalde is close to the Frio River and the Nueces River. So we go out there a lot, or used to before COVID. And so I just had that kind of in my head, the space of the river and Uvalde and that kind of stretch of the country. And so I started there, and then the character of someone who had gone, a woman who had gone away and had moved back, had decided to move back home and wanted to live there, came to me. And then with that came the conflict of, she wants to come home, but home has changed, right? It's becoming, Concan, the area we were, is becoming much more touristy and developed, and it's not quite the same as it was when I was younger, which is all good, but my character had a real problem with it. She didn't like that. So it all kind of stemmed from that, and it's my good place, my effort to, really get into a story is to go through place almost always. That tends to be a little limiting, maybe creatively, just because I know Texas and my corners of Texas so well. So I just draw from those again and again. But I haven't run out of stuff to write yet. So maybe that's a good thing.
Texas is very generative in that way.
It is really generative.
Yeah.
And if you write a place like, San Antonio, or you write a place like Houston or Galveston or the Valley, I mean, I don't run out of characters because people are so different in all these corners. And one of the things that I was very grateful, in how the response was when I was submitting my book, which is mostly set in Galveston. There's a few stories that launch out. It's a novel in stories, and there's a few that veer into a different place. So that story I was just mentioning in Concan is in there, but for the most part, they're all centered around people in and around Galveston. I feel like they're very different. There's so many different people in all these places. And one of the responses I got from, my agent and editor was saying the breadth of characters that you can find who aren't, maybe the perception of the Texas story, right? Because Texas has this huge myth and it's built on tons of mythologies and tons of histories. And they were approaching it as people who weren't from Texas. Like my agent and my editor are not from here. And, the unsung, untold stories of people who are living and thriving here and who found themselves here. In the case of my mother, I think about immigration a lot, people who find themselves here and create communities for themselves or don't, and people who have been here for generations since it was a different place, like my dad's family. And what happens to your identity and your personhood when so much of it is defined by a place that has such a personality, right? Like, if you find yourself in a place like Texas, and my mom would go home to the Philippines and people would ask her, like, if she had a cowboy hat and she rode horses, things like that. Like the perception of it is so interesting to me. So I haven't run out of things to write about yet. I just keep tapping into that well of, the specific places of South Texas, East Texas, Central Texas, the border, the Gulf, the cities, the rural areas, and then, all framed in the mindset of like, what does it mean to be from a place like this? What does it mean to have moved to a place like this? And what does it do to you if you feel stifled and want to leave, or if you are perfectly content, like living here and thriving there? So I tap into that a lot, and I haven't found a reason not to yet.
Tell us more about the novel. Congratulations. Will you tell
Thank
us
you.
about that? Yeah.
Yeah, it's in progress. I'm currently working on revisions, and it's the timeline is that it should be out next spring. So, okay. As I said, it was my dissertation first. It's called The Last Karankawas, and again, in progress. So as of right now, it's called The Last Karankawas. And it's a novel and stories. When I wrote it as a story collection. Those labels are very nebulous. Like people don't quite know which one is which, what the definitions are. I think of it in terms of a linked story collection, which is what it was when I wrote it first. Every story stands alone, but if you've read all of them, you can kind of see the small connections. Like you might have to dig a little bit, but you'll recognize a character and go, oh yeah, Beeve. Oh yeah, she was in the first story. I remember that. Or, oh, this is the place that was mentioned in 2 stories ago when she said she was going to be traveling, So the threads were there, but to me, they were very nebulous and they were very thin, because in my mind, I was working on each of these as individual stories, which I had done over the course of my school. When I sold it, and was very fortunate to like have an editor who allows me to kind of keep that vision, and she recognized too, hey, but this is a novel, if you want to call it. Like these are telling a larger story, and there's something beyond just catching an Easter egg here and there. Like, ooh, cool. She was like, there's telling this larger story with a lot of voices. So that's what we've been working on. I'm very excited about it, but it's a lot of work. Like it's just trying to figuring out the connections, the connective tissue that's there, and drawing it out and making it more apparent. I always tell my students and my family too, because they keep asking, like, is it a novel or is it not? Like how many, what do the chapters look, how many chapters are there? And I'm like, okay, it's not quite like that. It's, I equated a lot to the Marvel universe, just to say like, it's the universe, right? It's the Garza universe. You can watch Black Panther, and you can watch Iron Man, and you can watch Thor: The Dark World, and you can watch, what have you, Infinity War. And each of those would be probably great and fine on their own. But if you've seen the whole collection, you get the larger picture, right? So that's sort of where my book is at this point. It's much more Marvel universe in the later years than, the first ones where it was like, here's one episode of Thor, here's one episode of, Black Panther, here's one episode of Captain Marvel. That's how I think of it right now. So it's in progress to become much more unified and becoming one cohesive arc. told in many voices.
That's great. It sounds like there's also like an invitation to readers to imagine what they see as the connective tissue for themselves, right?
Oh,
And
thank you. Yeah, I
yeah,
think so.
yeah.
I think so. It's not apparent. It's well, I hope it's not, or maybe it isn't, and it should be more. These are the things I think about because I'm working on it right now. Like, is this too obvious? Is it too much? One of the things that I think is so funny to get asked is when I get asked about themes. What are the themes in your work? Which to me, if I think about themes, it's not going to be a good story. It's not going to be a good piece of art. It's going to be too apparent. I prefer to, like, there's certain threads and motifs that I know I draw from again and again, but I'm not consciously inserting them there. And so I'm not trying to manipulate the reader into saying like, yes, this is a tale about identity, like this is a tale about women's struggles and immigration, like they're there, but I would love it if a reader read it and said, no, like to me, this was about X, and down the road, somebody else says, no, to me, it felt like a story about Y. So I want that for the reader. I don't want to impose my own vision. I have my own thoughts about these characters and what they're doing and why I'm trying to present them in this way, but it's more fun to hear how people respond, where they find those threads and those connections.
It's one of the things I appreciate about the work of yours that I've read already, your published work. There's a sense of ambiguity a lot of times, right? That is really intriguing. And I'm looking forward to seeing those kinds of things at play in the novel that's forthcoming.
Thank
There's a
you.
lot of openness and expansiveness about what it means to come from the different kinds of identities, mixed race families, and that kind of thing. Like we could read it as, stories of identity, but there's so much more going on. It's just
Yeah.
super complex work that I've experienced of yours
Thank
already.
you
So
for
I'm
saying
really
that.
excited about this novel.
Oh, it's one of the things that it's so difficult, and I'm so proud of my background and my heritage and my many heritages and the many, clans that I can claim, but it often feels preachy when I write, and this isn't the case for everybody, but when I write, and if I'm trying to achieve at the end, well, this is the experience, right? Like, this is what it's like. That's not the case, right? But my sister, who has the exact same background as me, has a very different experience than I do. It's just one of the things that gets a little sticky about being a minority or being an ethnic minority or what have you, and writing or creating art, and then having people kind of impose like, oh, well, this must be the Tejana experience. This must be the
You must be
Filipina.
speaking for a group, being a
Yes,
representative.
congratulations.
Right.
Like, you've now represented all of them, and you're speaking for all of them. And I would hate for, someone down the road to say like, no, but what about my experience, which is different, and I have a similar background, like, and then so it never feels like I hate that. I hate that kind of pressure to put on writers of color, marginalized writers, like, oh, good, I read this book by a queer Latina, like now I understand the queer Latina experience. No, you don't.
Well, that whole
"The,"
right?
Yeah.
Right. You don't want your work to be kind of, sent into this category of like, this is the Latina experience, right? And which is what I really appreciate about it when you're thinking about Texas and the multitudes, right? And the multitudes of Latinidades, Asian experiences, like the connections, and just I feel like it's going to really blow people's minds to think about Texas in new ways, but not just Texas, because Texas is, I think, too small of a container for
Sure.
your work,
Yeah.
right? It's about just these larger stories and experiences that you're bringing to light and fictionalizing for us, and this just creating this, like you said, this universe, right? This imaginative universe, and so thank you for
Trademark
creating
that,
these
like the Garza
worlds.
universe.
Yeah,
No.
yeah, exactly, right. You've given grad students and critics a lot to work with already in
Yeah.
terms of how to interpret
This
your
is going
work.
to be real fun thinking
This
about
is
all
going to be
the.
a lot of fun. There's going to be a whole panel on this, right?
I'm
So
horrified by that idea now, Jackie. Thank you.
no, it's gonna be fun. No, just have fun with it. I guess I guess this is where I want to go, is think about, like you said, I don't want to think about themes, and like, or have, my experience kind of be projected onto other people's or kind of be representative. And so what are the things that motivate you when you are writing? Like, are you thinking about story? Are you thinking about the voices of the characters? Like, what are the kinds of things that drive you when you're generating?
It almost always starts with, like I said, it starts with place, because there's these places that I know very well that I don't see in literature, or I haven't, until now. And my, like I said, some reactions that I got when I was exposing it to bigger, places and bigger names was, well, that this is the this is a lens into Texas, right? That was partly what I wanted to do, but Texas is so big, the US is so big, the world is so big. But I was mostly looking at small corners of it, like we see a lot of border lit, which is wonderful. Well, I mean, a lot, right? A lot, whatever a lot means. But then I would think, well, what about these small, or you hear about hubs for immigration, like New York or San Francisco. And I was like, well, what about Galveston? That's where my mom and her family kind of settled. And there's this huge immigrant population in Galveston and in Houston more broadly, but for whatever reason, kind of migrated over to this corner of the coast. And for someone like my father, who's from the Valley, and which is, to people kind of from around there, North Mexico, South Texas, it's the same place. Like they used to cross
and
borders.
also the coast.
And the coast,
right?
yes, absolutely. Yeah. Like it's I mean, who decided these labels, right? Who decided the lines? And the lines have changed so many times and in so many, violent ways, that it was just, to me, kind of imperative that I see places that I know and experiences that I know that I haven't seen before in art and in literature. And if I do see them, they're often very, is the word caricaturized? Like what's the word? I'm trying to invent a word. I think there are a lot of stereotypes. There's a lot of cartoonish kind of portrayals of the violence on the border, and that's it. When you hear the border, you think violence, and okay. And if you hear Texas, you think cowboys. If you hear San Antonio, you think the Alamo. That's often my generation. My generative instinct is to just say, you know what, I'm going to put something on the page, like a place, an experience, and the kind of people that you find there or who find themselves there, and I'm going to create it just as compellingly. And my hope is to just as compellingly, just as complexly as how Faulkner does the South, right? How Hemingway does the expat experience in Europe. Those were books that I loved growing up. There was a time where I thought that was the only thing that could be literature. Like I can't be a writer because I've never been to New York. Like I've had this thought when I was 13, like, well, oh my God, like, I was reading The Great Gatsby and I was obsessed with it. And I was like, well, I don't know how to write New York. Like, this is, I don't have a white people experience, and this is all people want to read. I don't know how to do this. So that was often my experience. And then I had this, like a lot of people, I had a kind of awakening moment when I got to freshman English in high school. And my teacher, shout out to Mrs. Collier, assigned Sandra Cisneros, right? That was the first time I read Sandra Cisneros. And
House on Mango Street?
Yes, House on Mango Street. And I remember seeing it and having this moment where I saw Cisneros on the cover, and I had never read her before. I was 14 and thought, oh, I know, like, we have Cisneroses in this town, like that's a name I recognize. And it's this whole beautiful book about this Latina girl, this Mexican American girl growing up, and all the collective voices of the neighborhood. And that spoke to me. And it was this first moment of going, like, this is a person that we're reading their book, and they've done well, obviously, and it's getting taught. And it is about people who look and sound like us, right? Like look and sound like me, look and sound like people I know growing up. And I've never gotten over that experience. And so I like the idea, as lofty as it sounds, that maybe mine is doing that too, that somewhere someone will read it and go, yeah, man, that's what it's like to be an immigrant in Galveston, or to be, a second, third, fourth generation Tejana living in Uvalde. So that frankly pushes me quite a bit, just to kind of see places and people and lifestyles and the particular slang we use and the languages we use, like the little shortcuts and the references that all speak to us. And I like the idea that those are getting out there too. They're not, it's not at like Hemingway level, but they're getting out there and they'll be read, I think.
I don't know what Hemingway level means, right?
In terms of I guess in terms of fame, right?
But I love thinking about it, Cisneros level, Cáceres level, right? Creating that kind of universe, that world that speaks to people that don't often get to be represented, right? And also creating this whole, like, contributing to creating this cultural geography of the Gulf as well. I'm obsessed with the Gulf, and this is what my life's work has kind of been leaning towards. But also space. just the space, the place that's a place that has made me. And I'm often fascinated by work like Oscar's, like Cáceres, like in Brownsville, that reminds us that the Gulf is also part of the border lands, part of Tejas, and the kind that the Latinaxe experiences. And so that's one of the many reasons I'm excited about your work is really kind of opening up the place, right?
Mm,
And the places and the many complex geographies that that contribute to shaping those kinds of experiences that you
yeah.
fictionalize and write about.
And it's such a good, like you said, it's such fertile territory. It's such good space to think about all of these colliding questions and issues and areas. One of the stories that I revisited recently in my collection is a story that in which it takes place. I'm always thinking about place. It takes place, and I kind of I invented this a little bit because I realized historically this wasn't accurate at the time, so it's like a little anachronistic. But it's supposed to be set in, now I'm having trouble remember the exact year. It's in the 80s, like I want to say early 80s, maybe 83 or 82. And it's taking place on a casino boat that has been out in Corpus. And so like the characters all get on this casino boat and it goes out into the Gulf, just past, like I guess the Texas line, right? Like that invisible line that's there. And then there's this whole thing about, they make this big announcement, like now we can gamble, yay! And so everybody starts gambling. And at the time, I did do all this research because trained as a journalist, like part of me really cringes at like, oh God, so I'm gonna get so many people telling me like this wasn't accurate this year, like there were no casino boats in Corpus in 1981, but whatever, I invented it. It's happened in this story, and in my universe, that's how it worked. But I had so much fun thinking about, because I hadn't really accessed like the specific waters of the Gulf in my work at that point. And it was my character on the page was thinking through it, but I was thinking through it like, who decides these lines? Who deems it that right here, this marker is where Texas ends, and now this part belongs to the rest of us, and this part belongs to the state of
It's
Texas.
all called the Gulf of Mexico, but
Yeah, it
who
was so,
decided that? Right. Yeah.
yeah, it was just so bizarre. And so I had a lot of fun with this character who was calling bullshit as much as I was too. Like, who decided this? It's such good territory. And she was accessing it in this way because she's an immigrant. And so she was, thinking about crossing water to get here, and people who cross rivers to get here. And she crossed an ocean, and now they're out in the ocean and they've crossed lines. And, it's all getting at these big questions that I just constantly have. I make my characters do it because I'm always thinking about these spaces, and the Gulf is such a good one to think about.
I look forward to that one. Is
Thank
that one
you.
in? Is it part of the
It is.
novel?
It's a part of
Cool.
as of right now. Let's see. It's the penultimate story, I think. We'll see if that changes, but yeah.
No spoilers for the universe. We'll see.
I know, right? Yeah.
All
It's
good.
so much of it is plot driven. No, I'm kidding. My stuff is never plot driven. I tell friends and I tell students all the time that I'm really worried that my stories are like I call them Sims stories. Like I think I just have characters like move into a room and then they kind of like move around a little bit and say things, and then they like move into another room and say
Oh, but
things.
see, that's the kind of work I love, though, right? Like,
It's
yeah,
not very plot driven. It's very interior, very character driven.
it's
But
an experience, right? It's a
thank you.
universe, right?
Thank you.
Move
I
through the
think
universe,
thank you.
exactly. Some of the things I'm thinking about, you mentioned Cisneros, right? You mentioned having worked with Casares, McCracken, some other fabulous folks. Who are you reading recently, or who have you been inspired by maybe in the past few years?
Oh man, so many good ones just because of, rightfully so and belatedly so, like the influx of ethnic lit, right? Like of the other experience being brought to light. So many great, especially right now, timely, like so many great Black authors, so much good work by like LGBTQ poets and writers. I revisit, like some of the contemporary classic ones. Like they're not, it's not quite like early 20th century or anything, but like I think of people building off of the traditions of like Jhumpa Lahiri, Edwidge Danticat. Celeste Ng has really, with her first book, Everything I Never Told You, and with the like wildly popular Little Fires Everywhere, kind of looking at this urban Chinese American experience. I would say also Jesmyn Ward really impacted me just because just in the way, in terms of like place, right? The way she writes the South, the way she writes maybe Mississippi in particular. And she also, like in Salvage the Bones, right? She writes about Hurricane Katrina. So the experience of a particular family in this particular area of Mississippi, like waiting for Katrina, just because it's going to happen. So I thought about that a lot when I was thinking about Hurricane Ike, which features so heavily in my book. But yeah, like as far as I'm inspired by so many like current voices out there, and I'm just constantly hungry for more. I just read Colson Whitehead. You know, I'm very late to this party. I'm very late to a lot of these parties because I blame the dissertation. I just had my head down. I was like, I can't read as much. And this is the opposite of what I tell my students. Like, you should be reading if you want to be writing. But I just read Colson Whitehead and was sort of blown away. One that I read recently, I read this in like the last 2 years, was Ocean Vuong's novel. The genre is different, right? Like it's a little blended, but the novel, I think, is what they call it. On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. Oh my God, like that blew me away. Just lyrically, I mean, there's nothing like reading poetry if you're a prose writer. There's nothing like it because it just gets into your head all kinds of ways. And I think I write some of my best work after I've read poetry. Yeah, which not my poetry is still terrible, but like my prose gets so much better. But that one was so beautiful because I think of all the ways that he accessed, like, you know, these identity questions that we keep asking and what it's like to be part of this very close family. I write family a lot because it's such a big part of my life. And yeah, like I'm constantly thinking about the great new voices that are out there. I would say also too, just because it's sitting right in front of me and my students are reading it, and so I'm rereading it, like Tommy Orange, they're there. Yeah. Linked, right? The novel and stories kind of format, the voices, the speaking to it's ticking all of my boxes because it's like the big cast of characters, the entwined storylines, the place, you know, Oakland in particular, and how Oakland as a city is representative of how it's working with the native experience. And yeah, it's awesome. It's so many good contemporary writers that really blown me away in the last couple of years.
Great. Yes, all good ones. Love all of those, and just thinking about the mix of those influences.
Yeah, it's so
In your
hard. I got
work.
asked this.
Yeah.
I got asked this question, I think, by it was when I was submitting my book, and it was something that they would ask, which is like, who do you see your book positioned next to on a shelf? You know, like who would you see it next to? And it's so hard. I just want to throw so many people on that bookshelf, like next to me. And then it also feels very presumptive. Like, well,
Let's make a bigger shelf too, right?
Yeah, it's like we're just gonna make a huge, you know, what library would they all be next to, and what section in the bookstore would they all be next to? But yeah,
or create new sections too, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Right. New labels, new categories.
Put us all on the same shelf.
This may be a sensitive question, but I want to throw it out there. It's something that I struggle with, and I think Latinx writers I've seen struggle with it a lot in different kinds of ways, and that's the relationship to indigeneity. I'm thinking about like The Last Karankawas and the story that I'm familiar with, which I think is super generative in terms of thinking about the various kinds of identities on the Gulf and the things that we've been talking about, and then that you explore in the novel. Like, what are your thoughts around how do you navigate questions around maybe like being, kind of sensitive to or afraid of maybe appropriating indigenous identities or cultures, or how are you thinking about that?
I'm constantly afraid of where those lines are, right? And we have this conversation all the time about like intention versus your action. And the intention is always to present my experience, present the experiences that I know. But as a writer, you're thinking of where are the lines of creation too? Like at what point do we say like, I'm creating this and I, as a writer, have the right to impose this on my characters or put them in these spaces. And then again, I'm like, oh, but no, I don't have that right maybe for some of these. So I'm constantly thinking about this, and every other day I come down on a different line. I triumph at it, and then I'm like, want to hide under the covers because I'm like, oh my God, this book is called The Last Karankawas. Personally, I don't identify as Indigenous. If that's there down the line, with the Latina history, with my family history, perhaps, but it's not something that we've ever claimed or that I think we're aware
of. Or the Filipina history,
or the
right?
Filipina. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So like, and that gets into its whole thing, right? Like that's the Spanish and the colonizing, and yeah, absolutely. So no, I don't identify as that. So I don't approach this as saying like, I have the right to kind of, that's one of the experiences I'm trying to portray. So one of the ways that I think about that is because it gets into so many of those questions about like belonging, which I think my characters are always thinking about. I'm always thinking about it on the page. Who belongs where? Who decides who belongs where? And that's something I think about all the time. And, with like a lot of anything that sort of comes up in one of my mixed heritages is like, am I allowed to think about that? Because I'm not full, right? Like, am I allowed to write the immigrant experience because I'm not an immigrant, but my mother was, but then my father wasn't. So can I write that experience? It all becomes very, it's that like eternal question of, are you Mexican enough? Are you Filipina enough?
Or also the legacies of colonization, right? And what
Yes.
kinds of memories and histories we have access to or not. Because it's one of the things I see you exploring in the Last Chronicles story,
Mhm.
is thinking about how we've been cut off in a lot of ways to certain kinds of histories and memories, even within our families, right?
Yeah. Yeah. What
Mhm.
happens when those, and that goes down to absolutely the questions of privilege, like whose stories get passed down, who decides what the history is, the colonizers, right? Like the victors. And so in that story, which that's the central story for all of the book, which is why at this point it's the title story. The characters are a woman and her grandmother who's raised her, and the grandmother, they growing up on Galveston, and the grandmother has always told her that they are descendants of the Karankawas, that they are the descendants, and they're like among the few, because the Karankawas traditionally like kind of disappeared. They're considered like the disappeared tribe, and nobody really knows what happened to them. There's all kinds of theories, and as soon as I wrote this story, then I like made myself ill because I started Googling it and was like, oh my God, there's people who say that they're not gone and I'm inventing it. But in my book, the characters are believing this. Like, this is what I was
It's also
taught in
part of that
school.
myth, right?
Yeah, I was taught that in
Yeah.
school, that they disappeared, right? Like that was then. So my character Carly experiences that. She's like, I was taught that they disappeared, that they're gone. Who's to say that they are or they aren't? Because the grandmother believes so firmly that they are. She's always been told that they are. But there's questions about the validity of that, because the grandmother's also dealing with, she's very eccentric, and then she starts dealing with dementia, and then veers into this like exaggeration and invention of what she thinks is their Karanko identity,
Or what is memory, right?
what is
What
memory?
is
Yeah.
memory when we don't know whether it's her memories or not, or whether her body is failing, or all those different
Yeah.
kinds of things. Yeah.
She's invented, or she's performing these traditions that she's saying are traditions, and her granddaughter's like, this isn't a thing. And who's to argue that? Like, and so it all becomes, which I loved writing. Like, I loved being able to kind of, it's my little hint at the unreliable narrator, right? Which
Right.
but it's really true. Like,
Well,
who
what's
decides?
reality if she has her own universe?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So
Yeah.
who's to say? And there was a later point where I asked that question from her point of view, where she says, like, maybe I am inventing this, but why can't I? Who says that I can't? And who says that they have the right to impose my history and my past on me? Whether that's like, I can see that, under as a scholar and as a teacher and as a writer, I can see the debate about all of that. But I welcome that. I hope that it gives people a lot to think about, whether they come down on one side or another. I'm sure it'll uh, you know, dredge up a lot of questions and like critical thinking, but I hope that it does. This isn't, this, like I said, these aren't people or places that I've really ever seen exposed to art. And so I'm excited about that, and also
Great, great.
terrified. So I'll say
All good. Do you have an ideal imagined reader?
an ideal reader. No, because I think that I've often thought about that. Like, who's your reader? Who do you write for? And I find that if I consider one particular reader, it limits my writing. Also, I mean, I enjoy reading such a breadth of stuff that I don't know if I'm ever someone's ideal reader. Maybe I have to work a little harder to, understand or translate or just kind of get at what the writer is getting at. But I love that challenge. And so I would say, maybe if I do have one ideal reader, it's going to be somebody who's not afraid to put in some of the work, which might be that, my character's code switch and I don't italicize it, or I don't translate it, and maybe they have to Google it. A reader who isn't afraid to do that. Not necessarily someone who knows it all. I think, like, I get such joy out of, if I read like an Oscar Casares story and he references like going to Luby's after church. And I mean, that speaks to me. Those are moments that I love because they just resonate, like echo in the fiber of my being. Going to Luby's. Yes. But, and so I hope that a reader would get my references maybe, and like, have some of those echo with them. But I also hope that a reader, that those don't echo with them, and that maybe they start thinking like, oh, this is a thing, like a particular facet of that experience that now I've heard of, and maybe it doesn't awaken something in me the way that somebody who's from the Valley would see a Loopy's reference and like get it. But,
Right.
but
Readers, I am imagining, young readers in Texas, like reading this and imagining them imagining themselves being able to create art, because like, like it's not this like, esoteric kind of place they might not be able to imagine themselves. Like when I watched movies as a kid and like there was like snow all the time, I'm like, why,
yeah,
why are they even filming? It's too cold outside.
I
I'm like, what is
know. I'm
all
like,
that
you're
snow about?
gonna
Like it
freeze.
just was this like weird world that I didn't quite understand,
Yeah.
at the time because I hadn't been exposed to it yet. But I'm thinking about like readers going like, this writer knows what a Luann platter is. Brilliant. I can create a universe too.
Exactly. And like it's just something so particular about like these experience, like these little idiosyncrasies and these things that I love so much when I read them of somebody else's experience, right? If it's like the kind of the way I'm thinking of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and she has this great moment at the beginning of also one of the writers. Oh my gosh, one of the writers that speaks to me all the time. Like, oh gosh.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Her collection like blew me away. But Americana was wonderful, and I always think about the very beginning of Americana where it opens in like the hair salon, and the main character is getting her hair done, and like a white girl comes in to get like cornrows done. And I mean, I've never been in a hair salon that's working specifically on black hair and African hair, and so it was, I mean, I ate that up. I was like reading it going, oh my god, this is what this experience is like, this is what it feels like to have an outsider walk in, like I loved that. And so I like the idea that a reader of mine who knows the world will like have such a joy. Like, yes, they go to Sonic after the
I
3:30
think
bell
I've
gets out.
been on that boat you're talking about. Yes,
Yeah,
I'm
like they've
excited.
been on the casino boat, or I have all these references to like Galveston and Uvalde where they're driving down the road, and like there's the going down Broadway, and like it becomes the Causeway, and like to the you see Sacred Heart Church, and like all these little things that I hope speak to people from the places and from this experience. But I also hope that they reach people who aren't, like, because like I said, I get so much joy doing that. So my ideal reader would be someone who, if they don't get that experience, isn't afraid to kind of be open to it, and maybe do some of the work of like, well, I don't know, I don't have Galveston in my head, so like I have to look at a map and kind of see where the coast, where the Gulf is, where the bay is, like how you get to Houston, all that kind of stuff, which I so enjoy too. But I hope that the reader will do that.
And can you tell us who's publishing your book or anything about that?
Yeah, so Holtz is my publisher. They're publishing my novel and stories, The Last Karankawas, and they've also signed a contract with them for the second book, which is still up in the air. So I'm focusing on this one first, but at this point it's a novel, like a traditional, we can call it a novel. It's a novel. It's still the formation of it in my brain is still kind of being worked out, but I've been spending time thinking about the characters, spending time with them on the page. And at this point, it's about two sisters who are, mixed race. This is going to sound very familiar, but the mother is from the Philippines, the father is Tejano, and the mother passes away and prior to the book starting, but the mother has passed away. The women are in their young adulthood, and it sort of becomes this defining thing for them, and who are from these two very close knit, sprawling families, that this sort of linchpin is now gone. At the beginning of the book, or at this point, the start of the story has been the two sisters have kind of estranged themselves from everything. One of them has kind of rooted down into their hometown, and she's gotten married, and she's just like trying her best to kind of recreate the family they used to have. The father has gotten remarried, and the other sister has moved very, very far away. I think at this point I have her moving around in Paris. Like, she just wants to be gone. The inciting incident is that they've spent a couple years like this and lost touch with their families, and they find out that they've inherited a piece of land in the Philippines where that the mother was an heir to, along with her siblings and her family. So the sisters travel to the Philippines to kind of work out how to deal with that. The Philippines, like a lot of different countries, is not really a place where you can do all that stuff online or remotely. You just sort of have to be there and like bully people into doing things. So they travel overseas, and they're there with the rest of their mother's family. They're deciding what to do with this land, and they're kind of reconnecting with this family that's sort of dropped off the map for them through a lot of different reasons. Right?
So lots of different places and geographies.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
I was like, so the main thing is that, like I said, I'm so inspired by place. I've only been to the Philippines a few times, and it's been, the last time I went was probably like 10 years ago at this point. And so I'm hoping, COVID permitting, that I'll get a chance to go over there. My family has had all kinds of plans to go back, and COVID has kind of thrown a wrench into all of those. But the hope is that maybe next year we can figure out a way to get over there to see some of the extended family, and that I can kind of sit there and like soak up what it's like to be there, and how things are, how things move. It's going to take a lot of research. It will take, some trips if I can over there, but that's the idea of it at this point. And so we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens when I start putting them on the page and moving them around in their Sims rooms. And then when I get them there, like what kind of goes down. I'm always very open to like letting the characters move around on the page and then kind of seeing what they do. They teach me as much about what is going to happen as like the creator does, right? So that's always fun.
Well, I feel like I could talk to you about your work all day. I'm really excited about it. Anything coming out around the bend before the novel that we should know about?
As far as publications,
Yeah.
I have a story coming out in Hindsight magazine. I think it's their spring or summer issue, so it's probably coming out pretty soon. Other than that, no, I'm mostly trying to put the nose to the grindstone and get this one done, right? Like
I feel like I should just I shouldn't be taking up your time because I want you to write the book so I can read it.
No, this was wonderful. Like it's all in a process, right? Like, so right now it's with my editor. I did all of these changes to it and she's got it. She's going to be sending me back, and then I'll dig into it again. So this time, probably next week, I would be very like drained from that, but this has been really fun.
No, I really look forward to your novel coming out.
Thank
And
you.
wish you the best of luck. And I'm really excited about the successes you're already seeing and the way that people are taking up your work and obviously
you.
responding to it. There's definitely a demand and a readership, and just know that there are a lot of folks who are rooting for you and looking forward to you sharing more of your stories in the world.
So nice. Thank you very much. I hope that's the case. And I hope it entertains people and it does you proud too. I'm very grateful to have been part of this. And thank you for all your work and what you're doing to lift up, Latinx writers and the places and the spaces and the stories that we tell. So thank you for that. It's so important. And I feel very honored.
Thank you for contributing to that universe and creating new universes for us to move through and experience with you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. This is the Queens of Santo Niño. I'll just read a bit of it. In the parking lot of Sacred Heart Catholic Church, in the cool dusk, which is a lie already because it is never really cool, not even on this January evening, since this is Texas, and more specifically, this is Galveston, we wait. We sit on the concrete, ducking into windows of each other's parked cars to chat, or we sit inside with the AC blasting, or we simply lean against the walls and watch twilight draw shadows like a dark veil around the church. We are there before even the priest arrives to unlock the doors, where the volunteer choir sets up their amps and microphone stands. We are already putting ourselves to work. We prowl for things to do, tasks to help with. Some of us cart in vases of flowers from our new Buicks. Some of us arrive in hand-me-down Hondas. We arrange flowers on the altar or at the feet of the Blessed Mother's statue or beside the portrait of the Sacred Heart of Jesus for whom this church is named. Some of us, humming with the energy of the Santo Niño feast day, buzz about distributing paper programs, the ones we have used since we started this event many years ago. The programs are battered, creased from our hands, pocked by ink blots and typos where we list the schedule of the Mass, the Tagalog prayers we will say together, the Tagalog songs we will sing. We place copies in each pew. We sit or kneel on the cushions, our fingers pressed to rosary beads. We tune our guitars or warble a few chords of the opening song. I am going to sing a tiny bit just because of this line. I hear the song in my head when I write it. O Santo Niñong Marikit. Okay, that's it. That's all I promise. Our voices in song or in gossip echo in every corner of the Catholic Church on Broadway and 13th, which had been quiet before we arrived. We do very little quietly, and yet we quiet when Maharlika walks in. We turn to watch. She has that effect. She strides into Sacred Heart purposefully with her daughter. Carly, is that her name? Yes. by the hand. Hello, we call out to them and ask Maharlika, ¿Cómo está kana? I'm fine, she replies in pointed English. We flinch. We can't help it. Her English is sharp, intentional, a knife aimed at us. From her new crooked smile that shows teeth to the language she chooses in place of ours, lately she is reaching for weapons to use against us and the world. Once she was kind to us. She found us almost immediately, as every FOB does, bonding first with the ones who worked at the hospital. We walked her through the corridors and buildings of John Seeley, taught her where the supply closets and cafeterias were, where to purchase scrubs, how to update charts and input medical data. We instructed her on the Spanish phrases she would need to learn. ¿Cómo se escribe su nombre? ¿Tienes seguro médico? In our homes, we passed her platters of rice and whole fish fried crisp. When she wept with homesickness, we rubbed her shoulders, shushing her as we all had done and needed before. On this feast day, the one day of the year, the Filipino community emerges from every sweaty corner of Galveston and unites to honor our patron saint. Maharlika was always there. She read at the podium, sang in the choir, served plates of pancit and adobo at the after party. She was one of us, wasn't she, once? Just like us, she washed up on this island with a nursing degree and a job at the hospital, having never set foot in America before that day. We thought she was embracing a new life as we had. Unlike us, she had family here. Her mother, who had immigrated long before, lived on the mainland in that snarl of suburbs off I-45 between Galveston and Houston. We did not know her mother, and when she died of cancer only a few years after Maharlika arrived, we felt no sorrow, but we went dutifully to her funeral mass, prayed the novena for her in Maharlika's apartment in Fish Village. We should have noticed it then, but we didn't. Should have seen the shape Maharlika's grief took, curled up sideways on the couch, cheek to the padded arm, slippered feet tucked beneath her as if she hadn't the energy to even take her shoes off. How she burst into sobs in the middle of shift change meetings, or standing in the grocery checkout line, or jogging along Harborside. We should have seen that her grief was lasting. We did not expect that when the next loss came, her man, it would shift again, reshape itself into a grief for the old ways, her old lives when she belonged to someone. A mother, a man, a country, when she was a child of something tangible in the world. Years from now, it will seem so obvious to us that she was never meant to be a mother or an immigrant.